Hi, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Becca Thornfield. My father told me I'd never lead anyone because women like you fold under pressure. He said this at my military academy graduation dinner in front of my entire extended family. When I tried to defend myself, he cut me off and announced that my younger brother Derek would be carrying on the family's military legacy instead. 3 hours later, I received a call that would make my father's face go white as a sheet. Want to guess who was chairing the next Joint Chiefs of Staff emergency session? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Now, before we dive into this story, tell me, where are you watching from? And have you ever had someone close to you completely underestimate what you're capable of? Drop a comment below because I read every single one, and trust me, this story is about to show you exactly why you should never let anyone put limits on your potential. Let me paint you a picture of how this all began. It was a crisp October evening in Arlington Heights, just outside the nation's capital. The kind of evening where the autumn air carries just enough bite to remind you that winter isn't far behind. I was driving my modest Honda Civic through the tree-lined streets toward my childhood home, a stately colonial that had housed 3 generations of Thornfield military officers. Tonight was supposed to be my celebration dinner. After 4 grueling years at the Riverside Military Academy, I had just graduated summa cum laude with a degree in strategic military studies and international relations. Not just graduated, I had finished first in my class of 847 cadets, earned the Distinguished Leadership Award, and been personally commended by General Patricia Hawthorne herself for my thesis on modern asymmetric warfare tactics. But as I pulled into the familiar driveway, past my father's pristine black Mercedes and my mother's silver Lexus, I felt that old, familiar knot forming in my stomach. The same feeling I'd carried since childhood whenever I was about to face Colonel James Thornfield, retired Army, decorated veteran of 2 conflicts, and a man who had never quite figured out what to do with a daughter who refused to fit into his narrow definition of what women should aspire to become. The house was already full when I walked through the front door. Uncle Timothy, a Navy captain, stood near the fireplace with his wife Diane, both nursing glasses of my father's expensive scotch. My younger brother Derek, fresh out of his sophomore year at West Point, was holding court near the dining room table, his dress uniform crisp and his confidence radiating the way it always did when he was in Dad's good graces. My mother, Patricia, not to be confused with the general, glided over in her emerald green cocktail dress, the kind that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Rebecca, darling, you look nice." Her eyes swept over my simple black dress and modest heels with the kind of maternal assessment that somehow managed to find me lacking, even on what should have been my triumphant evening. "Thanks, Mom," I replied, accepting her brief, perfunctory hug that somehow managed to convey duty rather than affection. The dining room had been set with the good china, the Waterford crystal and sterling silver that only came out for what my mother called significant occasions. Fresh flowers adorned the center of the mahogany table, and the lighting had been dimmed to create what I'm sure she thought was an appropriately celebratory atmosphere. But I could feel it immediately, that undercurrent of tension that always seemed to follow me into family gatherings. The way conversations paused just a beat too long when I entered a room. The way my father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly whenever my achievements were mentioned. The way Derek's easy charm seemed to expand to fill any space that might otherwise be occupied by acknowledgement of my success. We sat down to dinner, prime rib, roasted vegetables, and my mother's famous garlic mashed potatoes. The conversation flowed easily around topics that carefully skirted the reason we were supposed to be gathered, my graduation. Instead, we discussed Derek's latest academic achievements, Uncle Timothy's upcoming promotion to admiral, and the beautiful weather we'd been having. It wasn't until dessert was served, a chocolate torte that probably took my mother hours to perfect, that my father finally cleared his throat and stood up, crystal wine glass in hand.
"To Rebecca," he began, and for a moment my heart lifted with the foolish hope that maybe, just maybe, tonight would be different. "Who has worked very hard to achieve her goals." He paused, and I could see something shifting in his expression, a hardening around his eyes that I recognized from childhood. But let's be realistic about what comes next. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Uncle Timothy shifted in his seat. My mother's smile became even more strained. Derek looked down at his dessert plate. "The military is a demanding profession," my father continued, his voice taking on that lecturing tone I knew so well. "It requires split-second decision-making under extreme pressure. Life-and-death choices that can't be made by committee or with the luxury of second-guessing." His eyes met mine across the table. "Rebecca, you're a bright girl. You've always been good with books, with theories, with academic exercises. But leading actual soldiers in real combat situations?" He shook his head slowly. "Women like you fold under that kind of pressure. It's not a criticism. It's biology. It's reality." The words hit me like a physical blow. Around the table, I could see family members either looking away in embarrassment or nodding in quiet agreement. No one spoke up. No one challenged him. No one defended me. Derek, on the other hand, has the natural instincts of a true military leader, a kind of man soldiers will follow into battle without question. I felt my face burning with humiliation, but I wasn't about to let him see me cry. Not here, not in front of everyone. "Dad, I think you might be—" "I think," he interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut glass, "that this family has spent enough time entertaining unrealistic ambitions. Derek will be carrying on the Thornfield military tradition. That's where our pride and our support should be focused." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, the distant sound of traffic outside, even my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. And that's when my secure military phone rang. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The secure phone's distinctive ringtone cut through the dining room like a blade through silk. Everyone at the table froze. In military families, you learn early that when a secure phone rings during family time, it's never good news. It's either a crisis, a deployment, or something classified enough that it can't wait until morning. I excused myself and stepped into my father's study, the same mahogany-paneled room where he'd conducted his own military business for decades. The walls were lined with commendations, unit photos, and medals displayed in perfect formation, a shrine to the Thornfield military legacy that, according to tonight's dinner conversation, would apparently skip right over me. "Lieutenant Colonel Thornfield," I answered, using my full rank and surname as protocol demanded. "Colonel, this is General Catherine Morrison's aide. The general needs you in the Pentagon Situation Room immediately. There's been a development in the Kandahar province situation, and your expertise in regional asymmetric warfare is required for an emergency Joint Chiefs briefing." My stomach dropped. Joint Chiefs briefings weren't casual affairs. They involved the highest levels of military command: the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the service chiefs of all military branches. For a lieutenant colonel to be called into such a meeting was either extraordinary recognition or a career-ending mistake waiting to happen. "How soon do you need me there?" I asked, already calculating drive time to the Pentagon. "The meeting convenes in 90 minutes. Your security clearance has been updated, and all necessary documentation will be provided upon arrival. This is classified at the highest levels, Colonel." The line went dead. I stood there for a moment, staring at the phone in my hand, my father's words from dinner still echoing in my head. "Women like you fold under pressure." When I returned to the dining room, 8 pairs of eyes immediately focused on me. The tension in the room was palpable, that particular kind of military family anxiety that comes when duty calls during personal time. "Everything all right, dear?" my mother asked, though her voice carried that forced lightness that suggested she already knew the answer. "I have to go," I said simply. "Emergency briefing."
My father's expression shifted from curiosity to something resembling concern. Despite our complicated relationship, he understood the weight of emergency military summons. "What kind of briefing?" he asked, his colonel instincts overriding his paternal disappointment in me. "Classified," I replied, which was both true and the only answer I could give. Derek looked up from his dessert plate, his young face showing a mixture of excitement and envy. "Is it about the situation overseas? The thing they've been talking about on the news?" I couldn't answer that either, but Uncle Timothy, whose Navy intelligence background gave him a better understanding of these things, placed a restraining hand on Derek's shoulder. "Son, when someone says classified, that's where the questions stop." I headed upstairs to change into my dress uniform. My childhood bedroom had been converted into a guest room years ago, but my mother had thoughtfully hung my uniform in the closet, pressed and ready. As I buttoned the dark blue jacket with its rows of ribbons and insignia, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me wasn't the uncertain daughter who had been systematically diminished over dinner. This was Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Thornfield, graduate of the Riverside Military Academy, recipient of the Distinguished Leadership Award, and apparently someone important enough to be summoned to an emergency Joint Chiefs briefing on 90 minutes' notice. When I came back downstairs, the family was still gathered around the dining room table, but the celebratory atmosphere had completely evaporated. My father stood up as I entered, old military courtesy that was as automatic as breathing. "Drive safely," my mother said, kissing my cheek with genuine worry now, "and call when you can." Derek stood up too, looking suddenly younger in his cadet uniform. "Beck," he said quietly, using the childhood nickname he hadn't called me in years. "Whatever this is, be careful." My father walked me to the door. For a moment, standing in the foyer, beneath the crystal chandelier that had illuminated 3 generations of Thornfield military send-offs, he looked like he wanted to say something. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. Finally, he settled on, "Remember your training." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an acknowledgement of my capabilities. But it was the closest thing to paternal support I was likely to get. I drove through the Virginia night toward the Pentagon, my Honda Civic feeling oddly small and civilian among the convoy of black SUVs and official vehicles that seemed to multiply as I got closer to the massive 5-sided building that housed the heart of American military power. The Pentagon at night is an imposing sight. 5 stories of limestone and concrete that seemed to glow with their own authority under the security lighting. Even at this late hour, the parking lots were surprisingly full. Whatever was happening was big enough to pull personnel from across the region. Security was tighter than usual. My credentials were checked 3 times before I was even allowed into the building, and twice more before I reached the Situation Room level. The corridors buzzed with the quiet intensity of military personnel moving with purpose, the kind of controlled urgency that happens when something significant is developing. As I approached the Situation Room, I could see other officers arriving, colonels, generals, admirals, all moving with the same purposeful stride. Whatever had prompted this emergency briefing, I was apparently not the only one whose evening had been interrupted. A young captain with a clipboard intercepted me outside the briefing room. "Lieutenant Colonel Thornfield, I'm Captain Hayes, General Morrison's aide. The general will brief you on your role before the meeting begins." My role? That was interesting phrasing. Not the situation you'll be observing or the briefing you'll be attending. My role suggested I was here to participate, not just listen. Captain Hayes led me down a side corridor to a smaller conference room where General Catherine Morrison was waiting. I'd heard of her, of course. Everyone in military circles had. She was one of the youngest women ever to achieve 4-star rank, known for her strategic brilliance and her ability to cut through Pentagon politics to get things done. "Colonel Thornfield," she said, standing as I entered. Thank you for coming so quickly. I know this interrupted your family time. Of course, General. How can I assist? General Morrison gestured for me to sit across from her at the small table. Colonel, what I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room until it's officially announced. Is that understood? Yes, ma'am. She opened a classified folder and slid a document across the table. 3 hours ago, the president nominated you for promotion to brigadier general and appointment as the new director of strategic operations for Middle Eastern affairs.
The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at the document, my father's voice echoing in my head. Women like you fold under pressure. The Senate confirmation hearing is next week, General Morrison continued. But tonight, we need your expertise to brief the Joint Chiefs on the developing situation in Kandahar province. As the incoming Director of Strategic Operations, you'll be taking the lead on this briefing. I looked up from the document, my mind reeling. General, I'm honored, but... Colonel, she interrupted gently, you're the youngest officer ever recommended for this position. Your thesis on asymmetrical warfare has become required reading at the War College. Your strategic recommendations on the Afghan situation have been implemented at the highest levels for the past 18 months. You've been secretly consulting on Joint Chiefs decisions since you were a captain. The room seemed to spin slightly. Secretly consulting? Your analyses have been declassified and attributed to your recommendations. Every major strategic decision in the Middle Eastern theater over the past 3 years has had your fingerprints on it. Tonight, it's time for you to step out of the shadows and take credit for the work you've been doing. She stood up and handed me another folder. The Joint Chiefs meeting starts in 20 minutes. You'll be presenting the strategic options for the Kandahar situation. Are you ready? I thought about my father's words, about Derek's easy confidence, about the family dinner where my achievements had been systematically minimized and my future prospects dismissed. Then I thought about the 3 years of secret consulting, the strategic recommendations that had apparently been shaping American military policy without my family or anyone else knowing about it. Yes, ma'am, I said, standing up and straightening my uniform jacket. I'm ready. As we walked toward the main situation room, I could hear voices through the heavy doors, the low murmur of high-ranking military officials discussing matters of national security. In a few minutes, I would be walking into that room not as someone's daughter or someone's little sister, but as Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Thornfield, incoming Brigadier General and Director of Strategic Operations. The woman my father said would never lead anyone was about to brief the Joint Chiefs of Staff. General Morrison paused with her hand on the door handle. Colonel, one more thing. Your promotion announcement will be made public tomorrow morning. You might want to let your family know before they see it on the news. I smiled for the first time all evening. Actually, General, I think I'll let it be a surprise. The heavy doors of the Joint Chiefs Situation Room opened with a quiet whoosh, revealing a space that had witnessed some of the most crucial military decisions in American history. The room was larger than I had expected, with a massive oval table surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. Multiple screens lined the walls, displaying maps, satellite feeds, and classified intelligence reports that painted a real-time picture of global military operations. But it wasn't the impressive technology or the weight of history that made me pause in the doorway. It was the man sitting quietly in the corner, almost hidden behind a stack of briefing folders and tactical maps. General William Bill Rodriguez sat with the kind of stillness that comes from decades of military discipline, but there was something fragile about his posture tonight. His usually immaculate uniform seemed to hang a little loose on his frame, and the reading glasses perched on his nose made him look older than his 62 years. What struck me most was how isolated he appeared. While other officers clustered in small groups discussing the evening's crisis, General Rodriguez remained alone, methodically reviewing documents with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was preparing for something far more significant than a routine briefing. I knew General Rodriguez by reputation, of course. Every officer in my generation did. He was a legend,
a man who had served with distinction in 3 different conflicts, earned the Distinguished Service Cross twice, and had been instrumental in developing the modern counterinsurgency strategies that had shaped military doctrine for the past 2 decades. His tactical innovations had saved countless American lives, and his mentorship had produced some of the most effective military leaders currently serving. What I also knew, though it wasn't widely discussed, was that General Rodriguez was scheduled to retire in 6 weeks. After 43 years of service, he was finally stepping down, planning to spend his remaining years with his wife, Carmen, at their small ranch in Texas, where he intended to raise horses and try to forget the weight of all the decisions he had carried for nearly half a century. General Morrison guided me toward him, her hand gently on my elbow. "General Rodriguez," she said softly, "I'd like you to meet Lieutenant Colonel Thornfield."
He looked up from his papers, and I was struck by the weariness in his eyes. Not physical fatigue, but the deep exhaustion that comes from bearing responsibility for other people's lives for too long. When he smiled, though, it transformed his entire face, revealing the warmth and humanity that had made him such an effective leader. "Colonel Thornfield," he said, rising from his chair with the careful precision of a man whose knees had seen too many years of military life. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." His handshake was firm but brief, and I noticed the slight tremor in his fingers, a detail that probably escaped most people but struck me as significant. "The honor is mine, sir," I replied. "Your work on asymmetric warfare strategies has been foundational to my own research." Something flickered across his expression, surprise, perhaps, or gratitude that someone had actually read his work rather than simply knowing his reputation. "You've read the Kandahar analysis?" "Multiple times, sir. Your insights into tribal dynamics and coalition building were revolutionary. I actually referenced your work extensively in my thesis." General Rodriguez's smile widened slightly. "The thesis that's apparently become required reading at the War College." He gestured for me to sit in the chair beside him. "General Morrison tells me you've been doing some remarkable work behind the scenes." As we sat down, I noticed the contents of the folder he'd been reviewing: personnel files, casualty reports, and what appeared to be after-action reviews from recent operations in Afghanistan. But mixed in with the official documents were personal items: photographs of young soldiers, handwritten letters, and what looked like a list of names written in his careful script. "General Rodriguez has been personally overseeing the Kandahar situation for the past 8 months, General Morrison explained, settling into the chair across from us. "His strategic guidance has been invaluable, but—" She trailed off, and I saw General Rodriguez's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. There was clearly something being left unsaid. "Colonel," General Rodriguez said quietly, "how much do you know about the current situation in Kandahar province?" "I know there's been increased insurgent activity along the Pakistan border and that coalition forces have been struggling to maintain stability in the region. Intelligence suggests a new militant leader has been coordinating attacks with unprecedented sophistication." He nodded slowly. "What you might not know is that 3 days ago, we lost contact with a forward operating base near the village of Zarmin. 47 American soldiers, along with 32 Afghan National Army personnel and 12 civilian contractors." His voice remained steady, but I could see the weight of those numbers settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. "Lost contact?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew what that euphemism meant. "Overrun," he said simply. The base was attacked by a coordinated force that demonstrated tactical knowledge that should have been impossible for local insurgents to possess. They knew our patrol schedules, our communication frequencies, our supply routes. It was as if they had access to our operational planning. General Morrison leaned forward. "General Rodriguez has been advocating for a full-scale rescue operation, but the Pentagon has been hesitant. The area is heavily fortified now, and intelligence suggests the captured personnel are being held in a complex cave system that would be extremely difficult to assault." I looked at General Rodriguez and saw something in his expression that made my chest tighten. This wasn't just professional concern. This was personal. "Sir, do you know any of the personnel who were captured?" His hands stilled on the papers in front of him. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez. She was part of the cultural liaison team. 26 years old, fluent in Pashto, working on her master's degree in international relations. She joined the army to pay for college. He paused, his voice becoming even quieter. She's also my goddaughter. I've known her since she was 3 years old. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. This explained the tremor in his hands, the careful isolation, the methodical review of documents. General Rodriguez wasn't just dealing with a military crisis. He was facing the potential loss of someone he loved like a daughter. The Pentagon's concern, General Morrison continued, is that a rescue operation would require significant resources and carry substantial risk. The cave complex is in disputed territory, and any military action could destabilize our relationships with local tribal leaders. What they're really concerned about, General Rodriguez said, his voice carrying a bitter edge I hadn't heard before, is that I'm too emotionally invested to make objective strategic decisions. They think my judgment is compromised because Sarah is family. I could see the impossible position he was in. Military protocol demanded objectivity, but asking him to abandon someone he'd watched grow up was asking him to abandon everything that made him human. The very compassion and personal investment that made him such an effective leader was now being used as a reason to sideline him. "What's the current status of rescue planning?" I asked.
"That's why you're here," General Morrison said. "The Joint Chiefs want an outside assessment of the situation, someone with expertise in asymmetric warfare, but without personal investment in the outcome." I looked at General Rodriguez and saw him trying to maintain his professional composure, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Not fear for his own career or reputation, but fear for a young woman who called him Uncle Bill and sent him pictures of her rescue dog back home in Colorado. "General Rodriguez," I said carefully, "what's your assessment of Lieutenant Martinez's current situation?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at one of the photographs in his folder. A young woman in military fatigues, smiling broadly beside an Afghan child. "Sarah's smart. She speaks the language, understands the culture. If anyone can survive in that situation, it's her. But..." He trailed off, his professional objectivity warring with his personal fears. "But," I prompted gently, "intelligence suggests the insurgent leader holding them is someone called the Shadow Commander. We don't know his real identity, but his methods are brutal. He's been known to execute prisoners to make political statements." General Rodriguez's voice was barely above a whisper now. "Sarah's been missing for 3 days. In situations like this, time is critical." I could see other officers beginning to file into the Situation Room, taking their seats around the massive oval table. In a few minutes, this room would be filled with the highest-ranking military officials in the country, all looking to me for strategic guidance on a situation that could determine whether General Rodriguez's goddaughter lived or died. "General," I said quietly, "what's your assessment of Lieutenant Martinez's current situation?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at one of the photographs in his folder, a young woman in military fatigues, smiling broadly beside an Afghan child. "Sarah's smart. She speaks the language, understands the culture. If anyone can survive in that situation, it's her. But..." He trailed off, his professional objectivity warring with his personal fears. "But?" I prompted gently. "Intelligence suggests the insurgent leader holding them is someone called the Shadow Commander. We don't know his real identity, but his methods are brutal. He's been known to execute prisoners to make political statements." General Rodriguez's voice was barely above a whisper now. "Sarah's been missing for 3 days. In situations like this, time is critical." I could see other officers beginning to file into the Situation Room, taking their seats around the massive oval table. In a few minutes, this room would be filled with the highest-ranking military officials in the country, all looking to me for strategic guidance on a situation that could determine whether General Rodriguez's goddaughter lived or died. "General," I said quietly, "what would you do if Lieutenant Martinez wasn't your goddaughter? If this was purely a strategic decision?" He looked at me with something that might have been gratitude. "I'd recommend immediate action. The intelligence we have suggests the cave complex has vulnerabilities that won't exist if we wait. The longer we delay, the more time they have to move the prisoners or strengthen their defenses." "And the political concerns?" "Sometimes," he said, his voice regaining some of its command authority, "you have to choose between political convenience and doing what's right. Sarah and those other soldiers didn't volunteer to serve, so we could abandon them when the situation gets complicated." As the room continued to fill with military brass, I realized that in a few minutes, I would be presenting strategic options that could save General Rodriguez's goddaughter or condemn her. The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders as I watched this decorated war hero trying to maintain his composure while facing the potential loss of someone he loved. My father's words echoed in my mind. Women like you fold under pressure. But looking at General Rodriguez, this man who had spent 4 decades making impossible decisions and bearing unbearable responsibilities, I understood that real leadership wasn't about never feeling pressure. It was about doing what was right despite the pressure, about making the hard choices when everything was on the line. In a few minutes, I would find out what kind of leader I really was. The Joint Chiefs Situation Room filled quickly as the evening's key players took their positions around the massive oval table. I watched the choreography of military hierarchy unfold, a carefully orchestrated dance where seating arrangements spoke volumes about power, influence, and institutional politics. At the head of the table sat General Marcus Blackwood, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Even seated, his presence dominated the room. His steel gray hair was perfectly groomed, his uniform bore enough ribbons to tell the story of a distinguished 30-year career, and his cold blue eyes swept the room with the calculating gaze of a man who had built his reputation on making hard decisions without flinching. He was known throughout the Pentagon as a strategic thinker who valued efficiency over sentiment, political pragmatism over idealistic rescue missions. As I observed the seating arrangements, I noticed something that made my stomach clench with recognition. General Rodriguez had been assigned a seat at the far end of the table, away from the primary decision-makers, positioned where his voice would literally carry less weight in the room's acoustics. It was a subtle but deliberate marginalization, the kind of institutional slight that sent a clear message about whose opinions mattered.
Even more telling was the way other officers interacted with him as they settled into their seats. Admiral Thompson, who had served with Rodriguez in 2 previous conflicts, offered a brief nod but didn't approach for conversation. Colonel Stevens, who owed his current position to Rodriguez's mentorship, avoided eye contact entirely. It was as if Rodriguez had become professionally radioactive, a man whose emotional investment in the Kandahar situation had somehow disqualified him from participating in the very type of strategic planning that had defined his career. General Morrison took her position 3 seats to the left of Chairman Blackwood, close enough to the center of power to speak effectively, but not so close as to suggest she was a primary decision-maker. She caught my eye and gestured, almost imperceptibly, toward a seat in the second row, the observers section, where junior officers and subject matter experts sat when their input might be needed, but their voices weren't guaranteed. As I moved toward my assigned seat, I passed behind General Rodriguez and noticed something that made me pause. Spread across the small section of table in front of him were the materials he'd been reviewing earlier, but they had been systematically organized in a way that told a story of professional desperation. Personnel files for the captured soldiers were arranged chronologically by age. The youngest, a 19-year-old private from Oklahoma, positioned closest to him. After-action reports from previous rescue operations were tabbed with color-coded notes analyzing success rates and tactical approaches. Most heartbreaking were the family photographs tucked between official documents, not just of Lieutenant Martinez, but of every captured soldier whose family had reached out to him personally, begging for information about their loved ones. This wasn't the workspace of a man whose judgment was compromised by emotion. This was the meticulous preparation of a career military strategist who understood that behind every tactical decision were real people with families, dreams, and futures hanging in the balance. But I could see that his preparation was being systematically ignored. When General Rodriguez attempted to distribute copies of his tactical analysis, a 20-page document that I could see was dense with satellite imagery, terrain analysis, and strategic recommendations, General Blackwood didn't even acknowledge the gesture. Instead, he accepted the document with a dismissive nod and immediately set it aside without opening it, sending a clear signal to everyone in the room about the value he placed on Rodriguez's input. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Blackwood began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that had made him one of the most powerful figures in the Pentagon, "we're here to address the situation in Kandahar Province. As you're all aware, we've lost contact with Forward Operating Base Sentinel. 47 American personnel, along with coalition partners, are currently unaccounted for." The clinical language struck me immediately. Unaccounted for was Pentagon speak that carefully avoided the word captured, just as lost contact avoided saying overrun. It was the kind of linguistic precision that allowed policymakers to discuss human tragedy without confronting its emotional reality. Defense Secretary Hamilton opened a leather portfolio and consulted what appeared to be a cost-benefit analysis. "Before we proceed with any discussion of response options, I want to emphasize that any military action in this region must be evaluated against our broader strategic objectives in the region. We cannot allow emotional responses to drive tactical decisions that could compromise our long-term diplomatic relationships." I saw General Rodriguez's hands tighten slightly on the edge of the table, but he remained silent. The message was clear. His concern for the captured soldiers, particularly his goddaughter, was being framed as an emotional response rather than legitimate strategic thinking. Admiral Thompson, the Navy representative, consulted his tablet before speaking. "Intelligence suggests that the cave complex where the personnel are believed to be held is in territory controlled by the tribal leader Malik Tariq. Our State Department contacts indicate that Tariq has been negotiating with us regarding mineral rights in the region. A military incursion could jeopardize those negotiations." What kind of mineral rights? I found myself asking, though I immediately regretted speaking without being formally recognized. General Blackwood's cold gaze fixed on me. "Lieutenant Colonel Thornfield, you're here as a subject matter expert, not as a voting member of this council. Please confine your input to direct questions." The rebuke was sharp and public, designed to establish clearly that despite my supposed expertise, I was not considered an equal participant in this decision-making process. But it also revealed something important. The captured soldiers were being weighed against mining interests. General Rodriguez finally spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "Sir, with respect, time is a critical factor in personnel recovery operations. Each hour of delay significantly reduces the probability of successful extraction and increases the risk to captured personnel."
General Rodriguez, Defense Secretary Hamilton interrupted, "your personal investment in this situation is well documented. While we appreciate your concern, strategic decisions of this magnitude require objective analysis uncolored by emotional considerations." The word emotional hung in the air like an accusation. I watched Rodriguez's face remain professionally neutral, but I could see the impact of being publicly characterized as emotionally compromised, a death sentence for any military leader's credibility. Colonel Stevens, Rodriguez's former protege, actually turned away when Rodriguez looked in his direction for support. The man who had taught Stevens everything he knew about tactical planning was now being treated like a liability, whose judgment couldn't be trusted. Furthermore, Hamilton continued, consulting her analysis, the estimated cost of a rescue operation would exceed $12 million, with no guarantee of success. We have to consider whether that expenditure is justified when weighed against other military priorities. $12 million. I did quick mental math. That was roughly what the Pentagon spent on office furniture in a typical month. The idea that 47 American lives weren't worth the cost of redecorating a few administrative buildings was staggering, but it was being presented as prudent fiscal management. General Blackwood nodded approvingly. Secretary Hamilton raises valid concerns. General Rodriguez, while your tactical experience is valuable, your personal proximity to the situation necessitates that we seek alternative perspectives. The systematic demolition of Rodriguez's credibility was breathtaking in its efficiency. Every strength that had made him an effective leader, his personal investment in his soldiers' welfare, his deep understanding of the human cost of military decisions, his willingness to advocate for those under his command, was being reframed as a disqualifying weakness. I noticed that other officers around the table were studiously avoiding eye contact with Rodriguez, as if his professional radioactivity might be contagious. These were men and women who had served with him, learned from him, and benefited from his mentorship, but they were now complicit in his marginalization through their silence. Colonel Thornfield, General Blackwood said, turning his attention to me, you've been brought in to provide an independent assessment of our options in this situation. Your analysis will carry significant weight in our decision-making process. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man with 43 years of experience and intimate knowledge of the situation was being sidelined as too emotional, while I, someone with theoretical expertise but no personal investment, was being positioned as the objective voice whose opinion would determine the fate of 47 captured soldiers. As I prepared to respond, I caught General Rodriguez's eye. He gave me the slightest nod, not pleading, not desperate, just the acknowledgement of one professional to another. In that moment, I understood that he wasn't asking me to save his goddaughter because she was special to him. He was asking me to save 47 American soldiers because it was the right thing to do. But I also understood that in this room, doing the right thing would be characterized as emotional thinking, while abandoning those soldiers would be praised as strategic pragmatism. The weight of 47 lives settled on my shoulders as I realized I was about to discover whether institutional politics would triumph over military honor, whether cost-benefit analyses would outweigh the fundamental promise that no soldier would be left behind. And I was apparently the only person in the room whose opinion would matter. I stood up slowly, feeling every eye in the room turn toward me. The weight of the moment settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. 47 lives hanging in the balance, General Rodriguez's career being systematically dismantled, and my father's words echoing in my head about women folding under pressure. This was exactly the kind of moment he had convinced himself I would never be able to handle. General Blackwood, I began, my voice steadier than I had expected. Before I provide my strategic assessment, I believe we need to address a fundamental issue with how this situation is being framed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. General Blackwood's eyebrows raised slightly, not in curiosity, but in the kind of controlled surprise that suggested I had just committed a significant breach of protocol. Lieutenant Colonel, he said, his voice carrying a warning tone, you're here to provide tactical analysis, not to question our operational framework. Sir, with respect, tactical analysis is meaningless if it's based on flawed premises. I could feel my heart pounding, but I pressed forward. We're discussing the fate of 47 American military personnel as if it's primarily an economic decision that fundamentally misrepresents both our military values and our strategic obligations. Defense Secretary Hamilton's pen stopped moving across her notepad. The silence in the room was so complete, I could hear the hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of helicopters landing at the Pentagon helipad.
Furthermore, I continued, looking directly at General Rodriguez, we're marginalizing the most qualified person in this room to provide strategic guidance on this specific situation. General Rodriguez has more experience with asymmetric warfare in this region than anyone currently serving. His tactical innovations have saved thousands of American lives over the past 2 decades. To dismiss his expertise because he cares about the outcome is not objective analysis. It's institutional cowardice. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. I had just publicly accused the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of Defense of cowardice. In any other context, such a statement would have been career suicide. But something about the systematic destruction of General Rodriguez's credibility had triggered something in me that went beyond career preservation. General Blackwood's face had gone completely stone cold. Lieutenant Colonel Thornfield, you are out of line. Your role here is to provide technical expertise, not to lecture this council on military values. Then let me provide technical expertise, I said, walking toward the main display screen. May I? He gestured curtly toward the controls, his jaw visibly tightened. I pulled up the satellite imagery of the Kandahar region, zooming in on the cave complex where intelligence suggested the captured soldiers were being held. Based on topographical analysis and recent reconnaissance data, this facility has 3 primary vulnerabilities that make immediate action not just possible, but advisable. I highlighted specific areas on the map, drawing on the research I'd been conducting for the past 3 years. Research that, apparently unbeknownst to me, had been influencing major strategic decisions at the highest levels. First, the main entrance faces southwest, which means afternoon sun creates significant thermal signatures that would mask the heat signatures of an approaching rescue team. Second, the limestone composition of these caves creates natural acoustic dampening, which would allow for closer reconnaissance than the insurgents would anticipate. Third, and most importantly, seasonal water patterns in this region mean that the secondary escape routes are currently flooded, limiting the insurgents' mobility options. I turned back to face the room. These advantages exist right now, today. Every day we delay, these tactical advantages diminish. The seasonal flooding will recede within a week. The insurgents will adapt their guard patterns, and most critically, their leader, the Shadow Commander, has a documented pattern of executing prisoners on the 7th day of captivity to maximize psychological impact. General Rodriguez looked up sharply. I could see he hadn't been aware of that particular piece of intelligence, and the implications hit him like a physical blow. His goddaughter had been captured 3 days ago. That gave us 4 days. "Where did you get that intelligence?" Admiral Thompson asked, leaning forward. "It's in the classified briefing materials that were apparently provided to me, but not to General Rodriguez," I said, looking pointedly at General Blackwood. Which raises the question of why the officer with the most relevant experience is being systematically excluded from accessing critical information about the situation. I could see General Rodriguez's hands clenching slightly as he realized he had been deliberately kept in the dark about key intelligence that directly affected his strategic recommendations. Defense Secretary Hamilton stood up, her voice sharp with authority. "Ma'am," I said, turning to face her directly, "what's inappropriate is conducting a strategic planning session about American soldiers' lives while deliberately excluding the most qualified expert in the room. What's inappropriate is framing the cost of a rescue operation against mineral rights negotiations while American military personnel are being held by insurgents who execute prisoners. What's inappropriate is characterizing professional expertise as emotional compromise when that expertise could save 47 lives." The room erupted in low murmurs. I could see some officers shifting uncomfortably in their seats, torn between institutional loyalty and the undeniable logic of what I was saying. General Blackwood slammed his hand on the table, demanding silence. "That is enough, Lieutenant Colonel. You will confine your remarks to tactical analysis or you will be removed from this briefing." But I wasn't finished. I looked directly at General Rodriguez, then back at the leadership table. "General Rodriguez, you've been analyzing this situation for 8 months. In your professional assessment, what is the optimal window for a rescue operation?"
It was a direct challenge to the room's power structure, asking the marginalized expert to provide guidance that the leadership had been trying to suppress. General Rodriguez looked up at General Blackwood, seeking permission to speak. But Blackwood's glare made it clear that any response would be considered insubordination by proxy.
I'm asking for professional military expertise from the most qualified person in this room, I pressed. Unless this council believes that political considerations outweigh military effectiveness. The challenge was clear and public. Either they would acknowledge Rodriguez's expertise, or they would have to explicitly state that politics was more important than military effectiveness, a position that would be impossible to defend if it ever became public. General Rodriguez cleared his throat carefully. In my assessment, immediate action is not just advisable, but necessary. The tactical advantages Lieutenant Colonel Thornfield has identified are accurate and time-sensitive. The intelligence about the Shadow Commander's execution patterns is concerning. His voice was steady, but I could see the fear in his eyes as he processed the 4-day timeline. Furthermore, his confidence growing as he spoke about his area of expertise, the political concerns about tribal relationships are overstated. Malik Tariq's territory is contested, and he has been losing influence to more radical elements. A successful rescue operation would actually strengthen our position with moderate tribal leaders by demonstrating our commitment to our people. Defense Secretary Hamilton's face had gone red with frustration. General Rodriguez, your emotional investment in the situation compromises your objectivity. We cannot base strategic decisions on personal feelings. Ma'am, I interjected, with respect, caring about the soldiers under your command isn't emotional compromise. It's leadership. And dismissing expertise because the expert cares about the outcome isn't objectivity, it's negligence. The words came out sharper than I had intended, but they crystallized something that had been building in the room. Several junior officers were nodding slightly, and I could see that even some of the senior leadership looked uncomfortable with the characterization of Rodriguez's concern as disqualifying. Colonel Stevens, Rodriguez's former protege, finally spoke up. "Sir, General Rodriguez's tactical innovations have been successfully implemented in similar situations. His expertise in this region is unmatched." It was a small crack in the wall of institutional silence, but it was significant. Stevens was risking his own career to support his former mentor. General Blackwood's voice was ice cold when he responded. "This council will make its decisions based on comprehensive strategic analysis, not on sentimental appeals or personal relationships. Lieutenant Colonel Thornfield, you will provide your tactical assessment without further commentary on our operational protocols, or you will be removed from this briefing immediately." The threat was clear and public. I had pushed as far as institutional protocol would allow, and probably beyond. But I had accomplished something important. I had forced the room to confront the contradiction between their stated commitment to military effectiveness and their actual prioritization of political convenience. Looking at General Rodriguez, I could see something had changed in his posture. He was sitting straighter, his preparation materials arranged more deliberately in front of him. My public defense of his expertise hadn't saved his goddaughter yet, but it had reminded the room, and possibly reminded him, that his 43 years of service and expertise still mattered. The battle lines were now clearly drawn. On one side was institutional politics, cost-benefit analysis, and the comfortable distance of treating soldiers as strategic assets rather than human beings. On the other side was military expertise, professional honor, and the fundamental promise that no soldier would be left behind. I had taken my stand. Now I had to deliver tactical analysis that would either save 47 lives or condemn them, knowing that every word I spoke would be weighed not just for its strategic merit, but for its political palatability to leaders who had already demonstrated they were willing to sacrifice military effectiveness for bureaucratic convenience.
The next few minutes would determine whether I was the leader my father said I could never be, or whether the system would crush both General Rodriguez and the soldiers whose lives hung in the balance. General Blackwood stood up slowly, his full height casting a shadow across the table that seemed to darken the room. The silence that followed was not the comfortable quiet of thoughtful deliberation, but the suffocating stillness that precedes a public execution. I could feel the weight of 20 pairs of eyes watching what was about to unfold, knowing that they were witnessing either a principled stand or career suicide, possibly both. "Lieutenant Colonel Thornfield," he began, his voice carrying the kind of cold authority that ended careers and crushed dissent for over 3 decades. "You have systematically violated protocol, questioned the judgment of senior leadership, and demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of your role in this briefing." He walked around the table slowly, deliberately, like a prosecutor approaching a defendant. Every step echoed in the cavernous room, amplified by the silence of officers who had suddenly found their notepads and tablets intensely fascinating.
"You were brought here," he continued, his voice rising slightly, "as a subject matter expert to provide technical analysis. Instead, you have chosen to lecture this council on military values, as if your 4 years of service somehow qualifies you to instruct officers with decades of experience on matters of strategic importance." I felt my face burning, but I forced myself to maintain eye contact. Around the table, I could see other officers' reactions, some looking away in embarrassment, others watching with the morbid fascination of witnesses to a public humiliation. Admiral Thompson was studying his hands. Colonel Stevens, who had briefly spoken up for General Rodriguez, now seemed to be trying to make himself invisible. "Furthermore," General Blackwood said, stopping directly behind my chair, "your emotional outburst regarding General Rodriguez demonstrates exactly the kind of compromised judgment we cannot afford in situations of this magnitude. You have allowed personal sentiment to override professional objectivity." The irony was staggering. I was being accused of emotional compromise for defending an expert whose expertise was being dismissed because of alleged emotional compromise. But pointing out that irony now would only dig my grave deeper. Defense Secretary Hamilton rose from her seat, her expression a mixture of disappointment and barely controlled anger. "Lieutenant Colonel, when the Pentagon invited you to participate in this briefing, it was based on representations about your professionalism and objectivity. Your performance tonight has been deeply disappointing." She opened a folder and pulled out what appeared to be an official document. "I have here your personnel file, including performance evaluations from your time at Riverside Military Academy and your subsequent service record. While your academic achievements are notable, there are several concerning patterns." My stomach dropped. I had no idea what she was about to reveal, but the fact that she had brought my personnel file to what was supposed to be a tactical briefing suggested this moment had been anticipated, possibly even orchestrated. "Your instructors at Riverside noted a tendency toward insubordination disguised as intellectual challenge," she read aloud. "Your commanding officer during your first deployment described you as brilliant but difficult to manage, with a tendency to question established protocols." The words hit like physical blows. These were evaluations I had never seen, assessments that had apparently been following me throughout my career like shadows, but more than that, they were being weaponized against me in front of the most senior military leadership in the country. "Most concerning," Hamilton continued, consulting another document, "is intelligence suggesting that your recent promotion recommendation was based not on merit but on political considerations. There are questions about whether your selection was influenced by diversity initiatives rather than genuine qualifications." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. They had just publicly suggested that everything I had achieved was not because of my competence, but because of my gender, a narrative that would follow me for the rest of my career, regardless of what happened next. I looked around the table, searching for any sign of support, any indication that someone else in the room recognized the systematic destruction of my credibility that was taking place. Admiral Thompson was still studying his hands. Colonel Stevens had actually turned away. Even General Morrison, who had brought me here, was avoiding eye contact. But it was General Rodriguez's expression that hit me hardest. He was watching this character assassination with the horrified recognition of someone who understood exactly what was happening because the same techniques had been used against him. They were destroying my credibility, using the same playbook they had used to marginalize him, questioning my emotional stability, my professional competence, and my right to be in the room. "Stand up, Lieutenant Colonel," General Blackwood commanded. I rose slowly, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. The symbolism was clear. I was being made to stand while everyone else remained seated, physically demonstrating my isolation and subordination.
Your behavior tonight has been unacceptable and unbecoming of an officer in the United States military, he announced, his voice now loud enough to carry to every corner of the room. You have displayed poor judgment, insubordination, and a fundamental misunderstanding of military protocol and respect for chain of command. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle before delivering what I knew would be the final blow. Effective immediately, your security clearance is suspended pending a full review of your fitness for classified assignments. Your participation in this briefing is terminated. You will be escorted from this facility and will have no further involvement in decisions regarding the Kandahar situation. The words hit like a sledgehammer. Security clearance suspension was a career death sentence for any military officer. It meant I would be excluded from any meaningful assignment, relegated to administrative duties, while investigators combed through every aspect of my professional and personal life, looking for justification for the decision that had already been made. But more than my career, they were removing the only voice in the room that had been willing to advocate for the captured soldiers and support General Rodriguez's expertise. With me gone, there would be no one left to challenge their decision to abandon 47 American military personnel for the sake of political convenience and mineral rights negotiations. "Security will escort you out," Hamilton added, pressing a button on the conference table intercom. "Your personal effects will be returned to you after they've been properly searched." 2 military police officers entered the room almost immediately. Their quick arrival suggested this moment had been planned from the beginning. They positioned themselves on either side of me, their presence making it clear that I was being treated not as a fellow officer, but as a security threat. As I was led toward the door, I turned back toward General Rodriguez. He was staring at the photographs of the captured soldiers spread across the table in front of him, his shoulders sagging with the weight of knowing that his goddaughter and 47 other Americans were about to be abandoned by the very institution they had sworn to serve. "General Rodriguez," I called out, causing the MPs to pause. "Sarah Martinez and those other soldiers deserve better than this." "That's enough," General Blackwood snapped. "Remove her immediately." As the heavy doors closed behind me, I caught one last glimpse of the Situation Room. General Rodriguez sat alone at the far end of the table, surrounded by empty chairs and dismissed expertise, while the leadership discussed cost-benefit analyses and political considerations that would determine whether 47 Americans lived or died. I had been systematically destroyed, my credibility shredded, my career ended, and my character assassinated, all for the crime of believing that military expertise should matter more than political convenience, and that soldiers' lives should be worth more than mining rights. Walking down the Pentagon corridor flanked by military police officers, I realized that my father had been wrong about one thing. I hadn't folded under pressure. I had been bulldozed by institutional corruption masquerading as professional standards. But as we approached the exit, I also realized something else. This wasn't over. They could destroy my career, suspend my clearance, and humiliate me in front of the Joint Chiefs. But they couldn't change the fact that I was right about the tactical situation, right about General Rodriguez's expertise, and right about the moral obligation to rescue those soldiers. The question was whether being right would matter when the only people with the power to act had just demonstrated that they valued political expediency over American lives. As the Pentagon's heavy glass doors closed behind me,
I stood in the cool October night air and pulled out my personal cell phone. There was one person who needed to know what had just happened, one person who deserved to understand that the system had just failed not only General Rodriguez, but every soldier currently serving who believed that their country would never abandon them. But first, I had a phone call to make to my father, because if I was going down as exactly the kind of leader he said I could never be, someone who chose principle over politics, even when it cost everything. I stood in the Pentagon parking lot for several minutes after the glass doors closed behind me, letting the cool October air wash over my face while I tried to process what had just happened. The institutional humiliation still burned in my chest, but beneath the anger and embarrassment, something else was stirring, a strange sense of clarity that came from having nothing left to lose.
Colonel James Thornfield answered on the second ring. "Rebecca? Is everything all right? It's nearly midnight." "Dad," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded, "I need to tell you something." There was a pause, and I could hear the familiar sound of him settling into his home office chair, the same leather chair where he'd delivered countless lectures about my unsuitable career choices and unrealistic ambitions. "What's wrong?" he asked, and for the first time in years I heard genuine concern in his voice rather than disappointment. "You were right," I said simply, "about women like me folding under pressure." The silence that followed was long enough for me to hear traffic in the distance and the sound of late-night helicopters heading to Andrews Air Force Base. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a mix of confusion and something that might have been regret. "Rebecca, what happened?" I told him everything. The emergency briefing, General Rodriguez and his goddaughter, the systematic marginalization of expertise in favor of political convenience, my decision to speak up, and the subsequent destruction of my career. I spoke quietly but clearly, laying out the facts without emotion, the way he had taught me to deliver after-action reports when I was a child playing soldier in his study. When he finished, the silence stretched even longer. Finally, he cleared his throat. "You defended someone who couldn't defend himself." "I defended what was right," I corrected, "even though it cost me everything." "Rebecca," he said, his voice softer than I have heard it in years, "maybe I was wrong about what it means to fold under pressure. Maybe folding means staying silent when you should speak up." It wasn't an apology. Colonel James Thornfield wasn't the type of man who apologized, but it was an acknowledgement that carried more weight than any words of regret could have. "Dad, there's something else," I said, looking back at the Pentagon's illuminated facade. "The briefing I was removed from, it's still happening. 47 soldiers are going to be abandoned because rescuing them isn't politically convenient. And the only person in that room who could save them is being silenced for caring too much." "What are you going to do?" he asked. It was a simple question, but it carried the weight of everything our relationship had been built on. For the first time in my adult life, my father was asking for my judgment rather than questioning it. "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but I'm going to do something." After ending the call, I walked to my car and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. The parking lot was mostly empty now, just a few official vehicles and the cars of night shift personnel who kept the Pentagon running during the dark hours when most of America slept, unaware of the life and death decisions being made in their name. That's when I noticed something. A sound that didn't belong. It started as a low vibration, almost below the threshold of hearing, like distant thunder or heavy machinery, but it was growing stronger, more distinct, and it seemed to be coming from the direction of the Pentagon helipad. I rolled down my window and listened more carefully. The sound wasn't the familiar whir of the standard military helicopters that regularly service the Pentagon. It was deeper, more powerful, the distinctive rumble of heavy rotors designed to carry significant weight over long distances. It was the kind of sound you heard when something important was arriving, when high-level personnel were being moved quickly and quietly.
I checked my watch, 11:47 p.m. Emergency briefings didn't typically receive high-priority helicopter support unless something significant was developing. The sound grew louder, and I could see lights in the distance, not the standard red and white navigation lights of military aircraft, but a pattern I didn't immediately recognize. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Parking lot, level B2, blue Honda Civic, come alone. I stared at the message, my pulse quickening. No one should have known I was in the parking lot, let alone known what car I drove or where I was parked. The text had arrived with the kind of timing that suggested I was being watched. But by whom? The helicopter sound was directly overhead now, and I could see the aircraft beginning its descent toward the Pentagon helipad. Even in the darkness, I could tell this wasn't a standard military transport. The silhouette was wrong. Larger, more angular, with modifications that suggested specialized communications equipment. Another text arrived. General Rodriguez needs your help. Time is critical. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. This could be anything. A trap, a test, a security breach, or something else. But General Rodriguez was still in that briefing room, watching his goddaughter's life hang in the balance, while institutional politics trumped military expertise. I started my car and drove slowly toward the lower level of the parking garage. The concrete structure felt like a tomb, my headlights casting eerie shadows on the pillars and low ceiling. As I descended to level B2, the helicopter noise became muffled, but still audible, a constant reminder that something significant was happening above.
The blue Honda Civic was exactly where the text had indicated, parked in a corner spot away from the main traffic flow. As I pulled into a nearby space, I noticed that the area was unusually dark. Several of the overhead lights appeared to have been disabled, creating pools of shadow that would make surveillance difficult. A figure emerged from behind one of the concrete pillars, a woman in civilian clothes, middle-aged, with the kind of controlled posture that suggested military or intelligence background. She approached my car directly, without hesitation, as if this meeting had been planned with military precision. I rolled down my window. "Who are you?" "Dr. Sarah Chen," she said quietly, "Deputy Director of Defense Intelligence. I've been monitoring the Joint Chiefs briefing." The title hit me like a physical blow. The Deputy Director of Defense Intelligence wasn't someone who lurked in parking garages unless something extraordinary was happening. She was one of the most powerful intelligence officials in the government, someone whose daily briefings shaped presidential decisions and international policy. "What do you want?" I asked. "To tell you that everything you said in that briefing room was correct, and to let you know that General Rodriguez isn't the only one who's been systematically marginalized for opposing this administration's approach to military operations." She handed me a tablet through the car window. The screen showed what appeared to be a secure communication feed, real-time intelligence updates about the Kandahar situation that were far more detailed and current than anything that had been discussed in the briefing room. "The Shadow Commander executed 2 prisoners this morning," she said quietly. "The Joint Chiefs weren't informed. They're operating on intelligence that's 12 hours old." I stared at the screen, watching satellite feeds and intercepted communications that painted a picture of a rapidly deteriorating situation. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because in about 10 minutes, you're going to receive a phone call that will change everything," Dr. Chen said. "And when that call comes, you'll understand that tonight's briefing was political theater. The real decisions have been made at levels that don't require Senate confirmation or public accountability." The helicopter sound was directly overhead again, and I could see through the parking garage entrance that multiple aircraft were now landing at the Pentagon helipad. Whatever was happening was bigger than a single emergency briefing. "What kind of phone call?" I asked. Dr. Chen smiled for the first time since approaching my car. "The kind that will make General Blackwood and Secretary Hamilton very uncomfortable. The kind that will remind them that some authorities supersede Pentagon politics and the institutional inertia that nearly cost 47 American lives."
She handed me a secure phone, military grade, encrypted, with the kind of technology that suggested access to the highest levels of classified communications. When this rings, answer it. And Colonel Thornfield, yes? Your father was wrong about you, but you're about to find out just how wrong he was. She disappeared back into the shadows between the concrete pillars, leaving me alone with the tablet, the secure phone, and the growing sound of helicopters that suggested the quiet crisis was about to become very loud indeed. I sat in my car, holding the secure phone and watching intelligence feeds that revealed the true scope of what was happening in Kandahar province. The Joint Chiefs were making decisions based on incomplete information, while soldiers died and political considerations outweighed military necessity. But Dr. Chen's words suggested that someone else was making different decisions, someone with the authority to override Pentagon politics and the institutional inertia that nearly cost 47 American lives. The secure phone remained silent, but I could feel the weight of impending change in the air. The helicopter sounds were becoming constant now, and the intelligence feeds on the tablet showed activity levels that suggested major operations were being coordinated in real time. Whatever was about to happen, I had the distinct feeling that my career destruction might have been premature. The question was whether the call that Dr. Chen had promised would come soon enough to save General Rodriguez's goddaughter and the other captured soldiers, or whether institutional politics would triumph over both military expertise and human decency. In the darkness of the Pentagon parking garage, surrounded by the sounds of arriving aircraft and the glow of classified intelligence, I waited for a phone call that would either vindicate everything I had sacrificed or confirm that sometimes being right isn't enough. The secure phone rang at exactly 11:58 p.m. The sound was different from any ringtone I had ever heard, a low, pulsing tone that seemed designed to cut through ambient noise and demand immediate attention. In the confined space of my car, it reverberated with an authority that made my pulse quicken. I looked at the caller ID display. POTUS Direct. My hands froze on the device. POTUS Direct meant a call routed directly from the President of the United States, bypassing all normal communication channels and security protocols. It was the kind of call that career military officers might receive once in a lifetime, if ever. I answered on the third ring. Lieutenant Colonel Thornfield.
Colonel Thornfield, this is President Elizabeth Warren. The voice was unmistakable. Calm, direct, with the kind of quiet authority that had made her one of the most effective commanders-in-chief in recent history. I apologize for the late hour, but we have a situation that requires immediate attention. I sat in stunned silence for a moment, my brain struggling to process that I was speaking directly to the president while sitting in a Pentagon parking garage after having my career destroyed just 30 minutes earlier. "Yes, ma'am," I managed to say. "Colonel, I've been monitoring the Joint Chiefs briefing regarding the Kandahar situation. Your performance tonight was exemplary. Your defense of military expertise and your tactical analysis were exactly what this situation required." The words hit me like a physical force. The president had been monitoring the briefing where I had been humiliated and removed. She had witnessed my career destruction and was calling it exemplary performance. "Ma'am, my security clearance has been suspended," I said, still struggling to understand what was happening. "Colonel, your security clearance has just been restored and elevated. As of this moment, you have been granted presidential authorization for access to all materials related to Operation Nightfall, the classified rescue mission that has been in the planning stages for the past 72 hours. Operation Nightfall. I had never heard the designation, but the implication was staggering. While the Joint Chiefs had been debating cost-benefit analyses and political considerations, a parallel operation had been planned and authorized at the highest levels of government. Furthermore, President Warren continued, "You are hereby promoted to the temporary rank of Brigadier General and appointed as Special Operations Coordinator for Operation Nightfall. General Rodriguez will serve as your senior tactical advisor." The parking garage seemed to spin around me. In the span of 30 minutes, I had gone from career destruction to speaking directly to the president and receiving a battlefield promotion to general rank. "Ma'am, I," said my voice, steadier than I felt, "what exactly is Operation Nightfall?" "The rescue mission that should have been authorized 3 days ago," she replied. "While the Pentagon has been conducting political theater, my National Security Council has been planning a real response to save 47 American soldiers. Dr. Chen will brief you on the operational details, but I want you to understand something clearly, General Thornfield." The title still felt surreal, but I was beginning to understand that this wasn't a dream or some elaborate mistake. "Tonight, you demonstrated the kind of leadership this country needs, someone willing to prioritize military effectiveness over political convenience, someone who understands that expertise matters more than institutional hierarchy. That's why you're going to lead this operation." Through my car window, I could see Dr. Chen approaching again, this time accompanied by 2 figures in military uniforms I didn't immediately recognize. They moved with the purposeful stride of special operations personnel, and I noticed they were carrying equipment cases that suggested immediate deployment capability. "General Thornfield," Dr. Chen continued, "General Rodriguez is being extracted from the Joint Chiefs meeting as we speak. He'll be joining you for operational planning. The mission launches in 6 hours." 6 hours? I looked at my watch. Midnight exactly. By 6 a.m., we would be launching a rescue operation that the Pentagon had deemed too risky and too expensive. "Ma'am, the Joint Chiefs will be informed of this operation after it's successfully completed," President Warren interrupted. "This mission is being conducted under direct presidential authorization, utilizing special operations resources that don't require Pentagon approval." The implications were staggering. The president was essentially bypassing the entire military command structure using special authorities that allowed direct control over elite units for operations deemed critical to national security. Dr. Chen reached my car and gestured for me to lower my window. She handed me a thick briefing folder marked with classification levels I had never seen before, along with insignia that I realized were general stars. "Dr. Chen has your operational briefing materials," the president said. "She'll also provide you with the full intelligence picture that the Joint Chiefs weren't given access to. General Thornfield, this operation has my full support and unlimited resources. Bring our people home." "Yes, ma'am," I said, accepting the folder and the insignia with hands that were surprisingly steady despite the magnitude of what was happening. "And, General," President Warren's voice carried a note of personal warmth, "your father was wrong about women like you folding under pressure. You're about to prove that sometimes the people who care most are exactly the ones who should be leading." The line went dead. I stared at the secure phone for a moment, then looked at the general stars in my palm. The metal felt warm, substantial, real, physical proof that the last hour hadn't been an elaborate hallucination. Dr. Chen opened my car door. "General Thornfield, we need to move. The operational briefing starts in 10 minutes, and we have a lot of ground to cover before the mission launchings."
I stepped out of my car, pinning the general's stars to my uniform collar with movements that felt automatic despite the surreal circumstances. The insignia seemed to change something fundamental about how I carried myself, not through any magical transformation, but through the sudden understanding that 47 lives now depended directly on my leadership. "Where's General Rodriguez?" I asked as we walked toward a black SUV that had appeared in the parking garage while I was on the phone. "Being extracted from the Joint Chiefs meeting by Presidential Security Detail," Dr. Chen replied. "General Blackwood and Secretary Hamilton are displeased, but presidential authority supersedes Pentagon politics." The image of General Rodriguez being escorted out of the briefing room by presidential security, while General Blackwood and Secretary Hamilton watched in stunned silence, was deeply satisfying. The man they had systematically marginalized was being vindicated at the highest levels of government. As we approached the SUV, I could see additional vehicles arriving.
military personnel carrying specialized equipment, intelligence analysts with portable communication systems, and what appeared to be special operations commanders with the kind of gear that suggested immediate deployment capability. "General," Dr. Chen said as we reached the vehicle, "there's something else you need to understand. Operation Nightfall isn't just a rescue mission. It's a demonstration that military expertise and moral leadership still matter in this administration, even when institutional politics tries to override them." I climbed into the SUV, noting that the interior was equipped with secure communication systems and multiple displays showing real-time intelligence feeds from the Kandahar region. This wasn't just transportation, it was a mobile command center. The Shadow Commander executed 2 more prisoners this afternoon, but he also made a mistake. He used communication equipment that allowed our intelligence services to pinpoint his exact location. We have a 6-hour window before he moves to a more secure facility. Through the SUV's windows, I could see the Pentagon growing smaller in the distance, its illuminated facade now representing not the seat of military power, but the institutional inertia we were bypassing to save American lives. "General Rodriguez is meeting us at Andrews Air Force Base," Dr. Chen said as we entered Andrews Air Force Base. "He's been fully briefed on Operation Nightfall and will serve as your senior tactical advisor. His expertise in asymmetric warfare and regional knowledge are exactly what this mission requires." I looked at the mission parameters, noting resource allocations that dwarfed anything the Joint Chiefs had been discussing. Special Operations Command had allocated 2 helicopter squadrons, a full intelligence support package, and extraction capabilities that included backup plans the Pentagon briefing hadn't even considered. "Dr. Chen," as we approached the gate of Andrews Air Force Base, "how long has this operation been planned?" She smiled. "Since the moment General Rodriguez was first marginalized for caring too much about his soldiers. The president has been monitoring the situation very closely, and she doesn't abandon people who demonstrate real leadership under pressure." As we entered Andrews Air Force Base, I could see aircraft being prepared for immediate deployment, helicopters, support aircraft, and what appeared to be a mobile command center that would allow real-time coordination of the rescue operation. In 6 hours, I would be leading a mission to save 47 American soldiers, using resources and authority that the Pentagon had claimed were unavailable. The woman my father said would never lead anyone was about to command one of the most complex special operations missions in recent history. But more than that, I was about to prove that sometimes real leadership means bypassing the system entirely when the system fails the people it's supposed to protect. The Special Operations briefing room at Andrews Air Force Base hummed with the kind of controlled energy that preceded high-stakes missions. Banks of monitors displayed real-time satellite feeds, communication intercepts, and tactical overlays of the target area in Kandahar province. The contrast with the ornate Pentagon briefing room was stark. This was a workspace designed for action, not political posturing. General Rodriguez stood at the center of it all, but he was transformed from the marginalized figure I had left behind just 2 hours earlier. Gone was the defensive posture and careful isolation. His shoulders were squared, his voice carried the authority of 4 decades of military leadership, and his tactical expertise was being treated with the respect it deserved. He was surrounded by special operations commanders who hung on his every word as he outlined the cave complex's vulnerabilities and the optimal approach vectors for the rescue mission. "The limestone formations create natural sound barriers," he was explaining to Colonel Marcus Webb, the special operations commander who would be leading the ground assault. "We can position teams within 50 meters of the entrance without detection, but we need to account for the thermal signatures created by the interior fires they use for warmth." It was exactly the kind of detailed tactical analysis that had been dismissed as emotional compromise by the Joint Chiefs. Here, it was being received as the expert guidance it had always been.
Dr. Chen guided me to a secure terminal where classified files were already loaded and waiting. "General Thornfield," she said, "before we proceed with operational planning, there's something you need to understand about why this mission has presidential authorization and unlimited resources." She pulled up a file marked with classification levels that required presidential authorization to access. The header read, "Operation Backfire, Pentagon Intelligence Suppression Analysis." "What you witnessed tonight in the Joint Chiefs meeting wasn't an isolated incident," Dr. Chen continued. For the past 18 months, there has been a systematic pattern of suppressing intelligence and marginalizing military experts who provide advice that conflicts with predetermined political objectives. She clicked through a series of documents that painted a disturbing picture of institutional corruption. Intelligence reports that had been edited before reaching senior leadership, expert assessments that had been classified and buried when they contradicted desired policy outcomes, military advisors who had been reassigned or forced into early retirement when their expertise proved inconvenient. General Rodriguez wasn't the first expert to be marginalized, Dr. Chen said. He was just the most visible, and his goddaughter's capture made it impossible to ignore the human cost of these political games. One document in particular caught my attention, a psychological profile of military decision-making that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the personnel evaluation that had been weaponized against me in the Pentagon briefing room. Those psychological evaluations that Secretary Hamilton read aloud, Dr. Chen asked, noticing my focus. They were fabricated, created specifically to provide ammunition for discrediting officers who showed too much independence or expertise. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. The pattern of insubordination and authority issues that had been used to humiliate me in front of the Joint Chiefs were lies, manufactured specifically to destroy my credibility when I became inconvenient. How many officers have been targeted? I asked. 47 documented cases over the past 18 months. Coincidentally, the same number of soldiers currently captured in Kandahar province. The president considers that symbolism significant. Dr. Chen pulled up another file that made my breath catch in my throat. Your strategic recommendations over the past 3 years, the ones you thought were academic exercises and theoretical analyses, they weren't theoretical. They were being implemented as operational policy. She showed me a series of classified operations that had been conducted based on my research and recommendations. Strategic decisions in Afghanistan, tactical innovations in Syria, and counterinsurgency approaches in Africa that had saved thousands of lives and prevented countless strategic failures. You've been effectively advising the National Security Council for 3 years without knowing it. Your thesis on asymmetric warfare has become the foundation for special operations doctrine. Your analysis of tribal dynamics has shaped diplomatic policy throughout the Middle East. I stared at the documents, trying to process the magnitude of what I was learning. While my family had been dismissing my career as insignificant, while the Pentagon had been characterizing my expertise as theoretical academia, my work had been shaping American military and diplomatic policy at the highest levels. The shadow commander that General Rodriguez mentioned, Dr. Chen continued, he's been successfully evading conventional military responses for 8 months, but his tactics follow patterns that your research predicted and provided countermeasures for. That's why this mission has such a high probability of success. She pulled up tactical analyses that showed how the rescue operation would exploit vulnerabilities I had identified in my theoretical work on cave-based insurgent operations. Strategies I had developed as academic exercises were being implemented as operational reality to save 47 American lives. General Rodriguez approached our terminal, his expressions showing a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal relief. General Thornfield, he said, his voice carrying newfound respect, I've just been briefed on your strategic contributions to Special Operations Doctrine. I had no idea that the tactical innovations we've been implementing for the past 2 years originated with your research.
The irony was profound. While my father had been lecturing me about women like me never leading anyone, my strategic thinking had been guiding some of the most successful military operations in recent history. While the Pentagon had been dismissing my expertise as emotional compromise, that same expertise had been saving American lives on multiple continents. There's one more thing, Dr. Chen said, handing me a sealed envelope. A message from the president. I opened the envelope and found a handwritten note on presidential stationery. General Thornfield, tonight you proved that real leadership means choosing principle over politics
expertise over expediency, and moral courage over career advancement. These are exactly the qualities this country needs in its military leaders. Your father was wrong about women like you. You don't fold under pressure, you transform it into the foundation for better decisions. Lead this mission with the confidence that you have the full support of the American people and their president. Bring our soldiers home. President Elizabeth Warren. I read the note twice, my hand surprisingly steady despite the magnitude of what I was holding. The President of the United States had personally written to tell me that everything my father had believed about my limitations was wrong, and that the qualities he had criticized were exactly what made me qualified to lead. General Rodriguez, I said, turning to face the man who had been systematically marginalized for the same principles I had defended. What's our tactical assessment? His eyes brightened with the satisfaction of an expert finally being asked the right questions by someone with the authority to act on the answers. We have a 6-hour window, optimal weather conditions, and intelligence indicating that the Shadow Commander has moved his prisoners to a section of the cave complex that actually makes them more accessible for extraction. He pulled up a detailed tactical overlay showing entry points, defensive positions, and extraction routes. With the resources we've been allocated and the strategic approach your research recommends, we have better than an 80% probability of successful extraction with minimal casualties. 80%. The Pentagon had been debating whether $12 million was worth spending on a rescue mission they claimed had minimal chance of success. In reality, we had better than 4-to-1 odds of bringing everyone home alive. How soon can we launch? I asked. Colonel Webb checked his tactical display. All assets are in position. We can be airborne in 90 minutes and over the target before dawn. I looked around the briefing room at the faces of America's most elite military personnel, special operations soldiers, intelligence analysts, helicopter pilots, and tactical commanders who represented the best of what our military could accomplish when expertise was respected and resources were properly allocated. Then, let's bring our people home, I said. For the first time since this crisis began, I felt completely confident that we would succeed. Not because the mission was easy, but because we were finally approaching it with the expertise, resources, and moral clarity that the situation demanded. The woman my father said would never lead anyone was about to command a mission that would save 47 American lives and demonstrate that sometimes the system needs to be bypassed entirely when institutional politics threatens the fundamental values that make military service meaningful. The rescue mission launched at 0430 hours under cover of pre-dawn darkness, with me commanding from the Mobile Operations Center, while General Rodriguez provided real-time tactical guidance to the ground teams. The next 4 hours unfolded with the precision that comes from combining expert strategy, adequate resources, and clear moral purpose. By 0847 hours, all 47 American personnel had been successfully extracted from the cave complex with only minor injuries and 0 casualties. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez was among the first soldiers loaded onto the medical evacuation helicopter, conscious and alert despite her ordeal. When General Rodriguez saw her through the live video feed, his composure finally cracked. 43 years of military discipline couldn't contain the relief of seeing his goddaughter alive and safe. But as our helicopters crossed back into secure airspace, Dr. Chen approached me with a secure tablet showing news feeds that were already beginning to report the successful rescue operation. The story was breaking across multiple networks simultaneously, and the coverage was extensive enough to suggest coordinated media strategy. General Thornfield, the president wants you to handle the public briefing about Operation Nightfall. It's scheduled for 1000 hours in the Pentagon press room. I looked at her in confusion. The Pentagon press room? The same building where I was escorted out by military police 6 hours ago? The same building where General Blackwood and Secretary Hamilton are currently trying to figure out how to explain why they opposed a mission that just successfully saved 47 American lives, Dr. Chen replied with a slight smile.
The president believes the public deserves to hear from the person who actually led the mission, not from the people who tried to prevent it.
The irony was staggering. In 6 hours, I had gone from being publicly humiliated and removed from the Pentagon to returning as the commanding officer of one of the most successful rescue operations in recent military history. At 0955 hours, I walked into the Pentagon press room wearing my Brigadier General insignia and carrying a folder containing the complete operational summary of Operation Nightfall. The room was packed with military correspondents, national security reporters, and television crews that represented every major news network in the country. General Blackwood and Secretary Hamilton sat in the front row, their faces carefully neutral, but their body language radiating the kind of controlled tension that comes from watching your political calculations proven catastrophically wrong in public. Behind them, I could see other officers from the previous night's Joint Chiefs meeting, all looking deeply uncomfortable with the sudden reversal of fortune. General Rodriguez entered through a side door and took a seat in the second row, his bearing completely transformed from the marginalized figure who had been dismissed 12 hours earlier. He wore the quiet confidence of a career military officer whose expertise had just been vindicated in the most public way possible. As I approached the podium, the room fell silent. Camera flashes created a strobing effect that reminded me of the lightning storms I had watched from my childhood bedroom, but there was nothing frightening about this moment. For the first time in my adult life, I felt completely prepared for the pressure I was facing. "Good morning," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the packed room. At 0847 hours this morning, Operation Nightfall successfully completed the extraction of 47 American military personnel who had been held captive in Kandahar province for the past 4 days. The first wave of questions came immediately, but I held up a hand for silence. Before I address questions, I want the American people to understand exactly how this mission came to be authorized and executed. I opened my folder and consulted the timeline that Dr. Chen had prepared. At 21:30 hours yesterday evening, the Joint Chiefs of Staff convened an emergency briefing to discuss response options to the Kandahar situation. I could see General Blackwood's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. During that briefing, the assembled leadership determined that a rescue operation would be too costly, too risky, and potentially damaging to diplomatic relationships in the region. The estimated cost of $12 million was deemed prohibitive, and the probability of success was characterized as minimal. I paused, letting the weight of those words settle before continuing. What the Joint Chiefs were not informed of was that the President of the United States had already authorized Operation Nightfall under direct presidential authority, utilizing Special Operations Command resources specifically designated for situations where institutional channels prove inadequate for protecting American lives. The room erupted in murmurs and the rapid clicking of cameras. I could see reporters frantically taking notes and several television correspondents speaking urgently into their microphones. Furthermore, I continued, the intelligence provided to the Joint Chiefs was deliberately incomplete. They were not informed that the Shadow Commander follows predictable patterns that make extraction operations highly feasible when conducted with proper resources and expert tactical guidance. General Blackwood was no longer trying to hide his discomfort. He was staring at me with the kind of cold fury that suggested he understood exactly what I was doing, publicly exposing the institutional failure that nearly cost 47 American lives. The actual cost of Operation Nightfall was $14 million. For context, that represents approximately what the Pentagon spends on administrative office furniture in 6 weeks. The mission achieved complete success with 0 American casualties and minimal resource expenditure. I looked directly at Secretary Hamilton. More importantly, this mission demonstrated that when military expertise is respected rather than marginalized, when resources are allocated based on strategic necessity rather than political convenience, and when moral leadership takes precedence over bureaucratic caution, American military forces can accomplish extraordinary things. The questions began in earnest then, but they weren't directed at me. Every reporter in the room seemed to understand that the real story wasn't the successful rescue mission, it was the institutional failure that nearly prevented it. General Thornfield called out Sarah Chen from the Washington Post. Can you explain why the Joint Chiefs were operating with incomplete intelligence? That's a question better directed to Pentagon leadership, I replied.
What I can tell you is that the intelligence available to Operation Nightfall included real-time updates, satellite reconnaissance, and communication intercepts that painted a complete picture of the tactical situation. Was General Rodriguez involved in Operation Nightfall? Asked Tom Rodriguez from CNN. I gestured towards General Rodriguez, who stood up with the bearing of a career military officer, finally receiving the recognition his expertise deserved. General Rodriguez served as senior tactical advisor for Operation Nightfall, I announced. His 43 years of experience in asymmetric warfare and his intimate knowledge of the Kandahar region were instrumental in the mission's success. Without his strategic guidance, this operation would not have been possible.
The room turned to focus on General Rodriguez, and I could see him straightening his shoulders as he prepared to address the same media that would soon be asking very difficult questions about why his expertise had been dismissed as emotional compromise just hours earlier. General Rodriguez, called out Maria Santos from NPR, were you involved in the Joint Chiefs briefing last night? I was present, he replied carefully, but my recommendations were not incorporated into the strategic planning process. Why not? Santos pressed. General Rodriguez looked directly at General Blackwood before answering. I was told that my personal connection to one of the captured soldiers compromised my objectivity and disqualified my professional assessment. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in that room understood the implication. The Pentagon had dismissed the most qualified expert available because he cared too much about the outcome. General Thornfield, called out James Mitchell from Fox News, how long had Operation Nightfall been in planning? The president authorized preliminary planning 72 hours ago. Full operational authorization was granted at 23:59 hours last night, and the mission launched at 04:30 hours this morning. So while the Joint Chiefs were debating whether to act, the president had already decided to proceed, Mitchell continued. The president determined that when American soldiers are captured, the appropriate response is to rescue them, not to conduct cost-benefit analyses about their worth, I said. Operation Nightfall represents what happens when military decisions are made based on military expertise rather than political calculations. I could see several reporters turning their attention to General Blackwood and Secretary Hamilton, who were clearly struggling with how to respond to having their decision-making process publicly characterized as political rather than strategic. Are there other situations where similar institutional failures have occurred? Asked David Kim from the New York Times. I looked at Dr. Chen, who nodded slightly from her position near the back of the room. The president has ordered a comprehensive review of military decision-making processes over the past 18 months, I announced. Operation Nightfall is part of a broader initiative to ensure that expert military advice is properly valued and that political considerations do not override strategic necessity. The questions continued for another 20 minutes, but the narrative was already clear. The Pentagon leadership had failed to protect American soldiers due to political calculations, while presidential authority and military expertise had succeeded in bringing everyone home safely. As the briefing concluded, I watched General Blackwood and Secretary Hamilton leave the room without speaking to reporters, their faces showing the strain of officials who understood that their careers had just been publicly ended by the success of a mission they had opposed. General Rodriguez approached the podium as reporters continued to ask questions, and I stepped aside to let him address the media that was finally treating his expertise with the respect it deserved. For the first time since this crisis began, the truth was being told publicly, completely, and by the people who had actually solved the problem rather than the people who had created it. The press briefing had barely concluded when Dr. Chen approached me with an expression that suggested the morning's revelations were far from over. She carried a leather portfolio marked with the kind of security classifications that required presidential authorization to access, and her demeanor indicated that whatever was inside would fundamentally change the conversation about institutional reform within the Pentagon. General Thornfield, she said quietly, the president wants you to review these materials before the congressional briefing this afternoon.
The House Armed Services Committee has called an emergency session, and they're going to want comprehensive documentation of everything we've discussed. She handed me the portfolio, and I noticed that my name was printed on the access log. Apparently, I had been granted clearance for materials that even most general officers would never see. The weight of the folder suggested extensive documentation, and the classification markings indicated that whatever was inside had been compiled over months or possibly years. "What exactly am I looking at?" I asked. "Proof," she replied simply. "Complete, undeniable documentation of everything that's been happening within Pentagon leadership for the past 18 months. Phone records, email communications, classified memos, psychological evaluation fabrications, and strategic intelligence that was deliberately suppressed or altered before reaching decision makers." We moved to a secure conference room adjacent to the press briefing area, where Dr. Chen activated privacy protocols that would prevent any form of electronic surveillance. The room's walls were lined with materials that blocked all forms of communication in or out, a modern version of the cone of silence that ensured complete confidentiality. The first document in the portfolio was a comprehensive timeline that mapped the systematic suppression of military expertise over the past 18 months. Each entry was supported by documentation that painted a disturbing picture of institutional corruption at the highest levels of military leadership.
This began in February of last year, Dr. Chen explained, pointing to the timeline's starting point. A series of strategic assessments regarding Middle Eastern operations were submitted by field commanders and regional experts. These assessments contradicted the Pentagon's preferred narrative about the effectiveness of current policies. She showed me classified memos from field commanders who had warned about increasing insurgent coordination, deteriorating relationships with tribal leaders, and the need for more flexible tactical approaches. Every one of these assessments had been classified at levels that prevented their distribution to operational planners, effectively burying expert advice that could have prevented subsequent disasters. The Kandahar situation was entirely predictable, Dr. Chen continued, turning to a section of the timeline that showed escalating warnings from regional experts over the past 6 months. General Rodriguez submitted 14 separate intelligence assessments warning about the Shadow Commander's growing capabilities and the vulnerability of forward operating bases. I studied the documented warnings, noting dates, classification levels, and distribution lists. General Rodriguez's prescient analysis had been systematically buried under layers of classification that prevented his expertise from reaching the officers who could have acted on it. Why wasn't this information shared with operational commanders? I asked. Dr. Chen pulled out another folder containing email chains between Pentagon leadership, because it contradicted the narrative that current policies were succeeding. Secretary Hamilton specifically directed that pessimistic assessments be limited to restricted distribution to prevent negative impact on congressional budget discussions. The emails were devastating. Internal communications showed Pentagon leadership deliberately suppressing intelligence that could have prevented the capture of 47 American soldiers because they were concerned about budget implications and political optics. "There's more," Dr. Chen said, opening a section labeled Personnel Targeting. "The psychological evaluations that were weaponized against you last night, this shows the full scope of that program." She handed me a document that made my stomach clench with recognition and anger. It was a comprehensive list of 47 military officers who had been targeted for career destruction over the past 18 months. Each name was accompanied by fabricated psychological evaluations, manufactured performance concerns, and coordinated campaigns to undermine their credibility. The list read like a who's who of military expertise: officers with distinguished service records, advanced degrees, and field experience that should have made them invaluable advisors. Instead, they had been systematically eliminated from positions of influence because their expertise conflicted with predetermined political objectives. 47 officers, I said, noting the symbolic parallel to the 47 captured soldiers. This wasn't coincidence. "The president specifically chose that number for Operation Nightfall," Dr. Chen confirmed.
She wanted to demonstrate that institutional suppression of expertise has real human costs, and that every expert who was silenced represented American lives that could have been saved. I continued reading through the documentation, finding evidence of communication intercepts that had been edited before reaching decision makers, satellite intelligence that had been selectively presented to support predetermined conclusions, and expert assessments that had been rewritten by political appointees with no military experience. General Rodriguez wasn't just marginalized for the Kandahar situation. He's been systematically excluded from strategic planning for 8 months because his assessments consistently contradicted the Pentagon's preferred narrative about regional stability. She showed me records of meetings where Rodriguez had been deliberately excluded, intelligence briefings where his input had been removed from final reports, and strategic planning sessions where his decades of expertise had been dismissed in favor of analysis conducted by contractors with political connections but minimal field experience. The most damning evidence, Dr. Chen said, is this. She opened a folder containing transcripts of recorded conversations between Secretary Hamilton and General Blackwood discussing how to manage problematic experts who provided inconvenient analysis. The conversations were shocking in their candor about treating expert military advice as political obstacles to be overcome rather than strategic guidance to be valued. We have Hamilton on record saying that officers like Rodriguez and Thornfield represent the old military mindset that prioritizes tactical concerns over strategic political considerations. Dr. Chen read from one transcript. She specifically recommended systematic marginalization of expertise that contradicts policy objectives. The conversations revealed a deliberate strategy to replace experienced military judgment with political calculation, treating soldiers' lives as acceptable costs for maintaining preferred narratives about policy effectiveness. There's documentary evidence of the psychological evaluation fabrication program, Dr. Chen continued, showing me communications between Pentagon personnel and contracted psychological consultants. They created a systematic process for manufacturing mental health concerns and performance issues that could be used to discredit any officer who became politically inconvenient. The program was extensive and sophisticated, a psychological warfare operation directed against the Pentagon's own experts. Officers who provided inconvenient intelligence were subjected to forced evaluations, had their security clearances questioned, and were systematically excluded from career advancement opportunities. How many careers were destroyed? I asked. 47 confirmed cases, with evidence suggesting the actual number could be much higher, Dr. Chen replied. The program was designed to create a chilling effect. Other officers learned to self-censor their expertise rather than risk career destruction. She handed me a final folder containing the most damaging evidence of all, communications showing that Pentagon leadership had been aware of the specific threats to forward operating base Sentinel for 3 weeks before the attack occurred. They had possessed detailed intelligence about the Shadow Commander's plans, but had classified the information at levels that prevented field commanders from taking defensive action.
They knew, I said, staring at the intelligence reports. They knew those soldiers were going to be captured, and they did nothing. They were more concerned about the political implications of acknowledging that their policies had failed than they were about protecting American lives, Dr. Chen confirmed. The capture of those soldiers was entirely preventable if expert intelligence had been properly valued and distributed. The documentation was comprehensive and undeniable. Phone records, email chains, recorded conversations, classified memos, and intelligence reports that proved beyond any reasonable doubt that Pentagon leadership had systematically suppressed military expertise, fabricated evidence against competent officers, and prioritized political considerations over American lives. General Thornfield, Dr. Chen said, when you brief the House Armed Services Committee this afternoon, you won't just be describing the success of Operation Nightfall. You'll be providing evidence of institutional corruption that compromised national security and directly led to the capture of 47 American soldiers. I closed the portfolio, understanding that I was holding evidence that would fundamentally reshape civilian oversight of military leadership. The successful rescue mission had been just the beginning. This documentation would trigger investigations, congressional hearings, and institutional reforms that would prevent future political interference with military expertise. The president wants you to know, Dr. Chen added, that this evidence has been corroborated by the FBI, the Inspector General's office, and congressional investigators. When you present this to the Armed Services Committee, you'll have the full support of multiple oversight agencies. I looked at the classified portfolio, understanding that it represented not just vindication for myself and General Rodriguez, but justice for 47 officers whose careers had been destroyed for the crime of providing expert military advice that contradicted political preferences. The woman my father said would never lead anyone was about to present evidence to Congress that would hold the most powerful military officials in the country accountable for betraying the fundamental principles of military leadership and institutional integrity. 6 months later, I stood in the same Pentagon briefing room where my career had been systematically destroyed, but everything about the space had changed. The ornate table remained the same, and the walls still displayed the formal portraits of military leadership, but the atmosphere was completely different. Gone was the suffocating weight of institutional politics and the careful choreography of predetermined outcomes. In its place was the focused energy of military professionals working together to solve actual problems rather than manage political narratives. The congressional hearings that followed my presentation of the evidence had triggered the largest reform of Pentagon leadership structure in 50 years. Secretary Hamilton had resigned within 72 hours of my testimony, followed by General Blackwood's forced retirement and the dismissal of 17 senior Pentagon officials who had participated in the systematic suppression of military expertise. President Warren had appointed me as the new Deputy Secretary of Defense for Strategic Operations, a position specifically created to ensure that military expertise would have direct access to presidential decision-making without being filtered through political appointees. It was a role that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. The woman my father said would never lead anyone was about to present evidence to Congress that would hold the most powerful military officials in the country accountable for betraying the fundamental principles of military leadership and institutional integrity. The briefing we were conducting this morning represented everything the new Pentagon was designed to accomplish. Instead of debating cost-benefit analyses of American lives, we were coordinating the successful extraction of trapped civilians from a natural disaster in the Philippines. Instead of suppressing inconvenient intelligence, we were incorporating real-time expert analysis from officers who understood both the tactical situation and the regional complexities involved. The typhoon has created unprecedented flooding in the Luzon region, reported Colonel Sarah Martinez, General Rodriguez's goddaughter, who had returned from her captivity experience to become one of our most effective liaison officers with international relief organizations. Local infrastructure has completely collapsed, but we have identified 17 extraction points where helicopter operations remain feasible. Her voice was steady and professional, but I could see the quiet strength that had developed from surviving her ordeal and witnessing the institutional transformation that had resulted from her rescue. She had become a powerful advocate for military reforms that prioritize protecting personnel over political calculations. Weather conditions will remain optimal for the next 6 hours, added Admiral Patricia Thompson, who had been promoted to Chief of Naval Operations after her quiet support during the congressional hearings had been recognized. Our Pacific Fleet assets are positioned to provide comprehensive evacuation support, with medical facilities prepared to handle up to 300 civilians. The briefing continued with the kind of detailed planning and resource coordination that was possible when military expertise was valued rather than suppressed. Every officer in the room contributed their knowledge without fear of political retaliation, and every recommendation was evaluated based on strategic merit rather than budgetary or diplomatic convenience.
General Thornfield, said Dr. Chen, who now served as Director of Defense Intelligence, we have presidential authorization for unlimited resource allocation. What's your operational recommendation? It was a question that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier,
unlimited resources allocated based on military necessity rather than political calculations. The transformation of Pentagon culture had been comprehensive and immediate, driven by presidential mandate and congressional oversight that had fundamentally reshaped how military decisions were made. "We proceed with full evacuation operations," I replied. "Every available asset, maximum coordination with international partners, and real-time adaptation based on field conditions. Our obligation is to save every life we can reach, regardless of cost or complexity." The room responded with the kind of focused energy that comes from clear moral purpose aligned with adequate resources. Officers began coordinating aircraft deployment, medical support, and logistics with the efficiency that had always been possible but had been suppressed by institutional dysfunction. As the briefing concluded and officers moved to implement the evacuation operation, General Rodriguez remained behind with me in the now empty briefing room. He was reviewing a folder of commendations and medal recommendations, recognition for the officers who had been systematically marginalized during the previous administration's tenure. 47 officers have been fully rehabilitated, he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a career military leader who had finally seen justice served. Their fabricated psychological evaluations have been expunged, their security clearances restored, and their career advancement opportunities reinstated. It was institutional justice on a scale that matched the scope of the original corruption. Every officer who had been targeted for destruction had been not only restored, but promoted, their expertise finally receiving the recognition it deserved. More importantly, Rodriguez continued, we've identified and promoted over 200 officers whose expertise was being systematically underutilized. The new promotion protocols prioritize strategic thinking and moral leadership over political reliability. The culture change had been comprehensive. Instead of rewarding officers who avoided challenging questions, the new Pentagon promoted those who provided the most accurate analysis and the most effective solutions. Instead of punishing expertise that conflicted with predetermined outcomes, leadership actively sought diverse perspectives and expert guidance. "General," Rodriguez said, looking at me with an expression that combined professional respect with paternal pride, "I received a call from your father this morning." I looked up from the operational reports I had been reviewing. In the 6 months since my promotion, my relationship with my family had undergone its own transformation, but contact remained limited and careful. He wanted to know if there were any positions available in the new Pentagon structure for retired officers with strategic planning experience. Apparently, he's been following the institutional reforms and believes he might have something to contribute. The irony was profound, but not entirely unexpected. Colonel James Thornfield, who had spent my entire life telling me that women like me could never lead, was now seeking to work under the leadership of the daughter he had systematically undermined. I wasn't dismissive of the idea, but I understood that any future interaction would need to be based on mutual respect and professional integrity. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "That all applications are evaluated based on expertise and commitment to institutional integrity, and that his daughter might be willing to consider his application if he demonstrates understanding of what real military leadership requires." I smiled at the diplomatic phrasing. After 6 months of rebuilding Pentagon culture around expert guidance and moral leadership, I had learned that the most effective approach to institutional change was to create opportunities for people to demonstrate growth rather than simply punishing past failures. "There's something else," Rodriguez said, handing me an envelope with presidential stationery. This arrived this morning. I opened the envelope and found another handwritten note from President Warren. "General Thornfield, 6 months ago, you proved that real leadership means choosing principle over politics, even when it costs everything. Today, you're proving that real leadership means building institutions that make such choices unnecessary. The Pentagon reforms you've implemented ensure that future military leaders won't face the choice between career advancement and moral courage. They'll be able to serve both simultaneously. Your father was wrong about women like you. You don't just lead, you transform the definition of what leadership means. President Elizabeth Warren." I read the note twice,
understanding that it represented not just personal validation, but recognition of institutional transformation that would benefit generations of military personnel who would never have to choose between expertise and advancement, between caring about soldiers and career progression. "General Rodriguez," I said, "what's our assessment of the Philippines evacuation operation?" "All assets deployed successfully, first evacuation helicopters are already in the air, and we're coordinating with 5 international partners for comprehensive coverage. Estimated completion time is 4 hours, with full medical support for all extracted civilians." It was exactly the kind of operation that had been deemed too expensive and politically risky under the previous Pentagon leadership. Now it was being executed with unlimited resources and full international cooperation, because the decision had been made based on military capability and moral obligation rather than political calculations.
As I prepared to leave the briefing room to oversee the evacuation coordination, I paused at the doorway and looked back at the table where I had been systematically humiliated 6 months earlier. The space looked exactly the same, but it now represented everything I had believed military leadership should be: expert guidance, serving moral purpose, with adequate resources and clear authority. The woman my father said would never lead anyone had not only commanded successful operations and reformed institutional culture, but had created a Pentagon where expertise was valued, moral courage was rewarded, and the fundamental promise of military service, that we never abandon those who serve, was maintained regardless of political convenience. 6 months earlier, I had been escorted out of this building for defending principles that seemed incompatible with institutional success. Today, those same principles had become the foundation for the most effective and ethical military leadership structure in American history. Real leadership, I had learned, wasn't about folding under pressure or accepting institutional failure as inevitable. It was about transforming pressure into the foundation for better institutions, and using the authority that comes from moral courage to ensure that future leaders would have the tools they needed to protect the people they were sworn to serve. Outside the Pentagon windows, I could see helicopters departing for the Philippines, carrying the resources and expertise needed to save lives because someone in authority had decided that saving lives was more important than managing budgets or political optics. That was the kind of leader I had always wanted to be, and despite everything my father had believed about my limitations, it was exactly the kind of leader I had become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.